Okay, I'm just going to get started and we'll see if anyone else shows up. How about that? Welcome to Advanced Competition Debating. Today, we're going to talk a little bit about counterplan competition, obviously, but more importantly, competition and how both affirmatives and negatives can utilize it as a strategy to defend and defeat particular types of counterplans that are commonly referred to as process counterplans. And I'll talk a little bit later in the lecture about why I'm not a huge fan of the term process counterplans generally, but that's basically the genre of argument that we're going to be talking about today. Counterplans are a very potent tool in the negative arsenal. We're going to be talking about counterplans that are designed to neutralize most, if not all, affirmative offense, and why those counterplans ultimately don't present a logical opportunity cost to the plan. But before we get started, this is going to be fairly informal. Feel free to interrupt questions, raise your hand at any time if something that I'm saying doesn't make any sense. Also, I'll leave a little bit of time at the end for Q&A and just general questions. This will be roughly divided into three parts. The first part is going to talk about competition and opportunity cost, so the notion of what makes a counterplan competitive. The second part is going to talk about different philosophies of competition. And then finally, we're going to talk about the notion of intrinsicness and crafting permutations. Let's get started, though, by taking a step back and discussing just the concept of counterplans. So the first question that I want to pose to you all is, there's no negative resolution. It seems rather powerful for the negative to be able to just fiat anything into existence in the form of a counterplan. If the question of the resolution is yes, no, should the affirmative policy be adopted, why does a counterplan that says we should, for example, pursue the same policy through the states or the Department of State instead of the Department of Defense, why does that prove the affirmative to be undesirable or a bad idea? Why do we think counterplans negate the AF? Yes.
Either you can't do it with YAF or it would be a worse idea to do it with YAF.
Yep. So we have the idea of there are certain counterplans that either cannot be combined with the YAF, or if they were to be combined with the YAF, it would be less beneficial than the status quo. My question, though, more broadly is, why does the negative get access to counterplans at all as a theoretical premise? Like, why does the negative get access to counterplans as a tool instead of just being able to read disadvantages to why the plan is bad? Yes.
Rather than just debating if the plan is a good idea or not, you should be able to test it from multiple angles.
We can test it for multiple angles. Yes, that's a common defensible here on arguments like conditionality. My question, though, is broader than that. Why do counterplans test the AF? Like, why does saying the state should do the AF instead of the federal government, why is that a test of the AF? Yes.
Because they avoid some harm to the AF.
Avoid some harm to the AF. So I think what we're all getting at is the notion of, and this is the term, first term that I'm going to write down, opportunity cost. The term you hear thrown out a lot in theory debates, competition debates. What it really means is the role of the judge in any of these debates is going to be, some form of logical decision maker, policymaker, sometimes a federal policymaker if you're trying to craft a theory interpretation that excludes the state's counterplan. The idea is that the judge in any of these debates is being presented the opportunity of the federal government passing a policy, in this case, the affirmative policy, and they should vote affirmative to do so if it is on net desirable. But consider the term desirability. Well, what does that mean in this context? Generally, you consider the costs and benefits of the plan in a traditional harms DA context. But consider this. If a policymaker could vote to pass the plan or votes to endorse an alternate proposal that was on the congressional floor that accrues the exact same benefits but avoids a potential nuclear war that would kill billions of people, what would be the logical policy option? Obviously, the policy option that every policymaker would choose is the one that best avoids the risk of nuclear war. And so what this ultimately boils down to is you can't determine whether a policy is normatively desirable or not, whether or not it's the affirmative policy, or really whether or not it's just like any policy that's being discussed in Congress, without comparing it against the slate of plans that could be passed within the same political window for passage, right? We're not just considering the plan in the abstract. We are considering a political opportunity to pass a policy, and we're considering the best, most net beneficial policy that can fill that political window. There are also normative reasons why the concept of counterplans are good. So, for example, the argument that it's most real world because advocates have to defend against multiple competing proposals for change all the time. Oftentimes the example you'll hear in these debates is Obama had to defend Obamacare from both the left and the right, from both single payer and proposals to privatize health insurance. And so when we're looking to do something like reform healthcare or increase security cooperation of NATO or reform the criminal justice system, we're not just looking at a single policy to do so. We're looking at the slate of potential proposals that could address the same harms and then considering the most net beneficial option out of all of those. So that's the reason why we have the notion of counterplans, is because a valid counterplan presents an opportunity cost to the AF. And if the opportunity cost is such that the benefits of the counterplan outweigh the benefits of the AF, then a logical policymaker should choose to endorse the counterplan. Does that theoretical premise make sense to everyone? Okay, good. So now I want to talk about the notion of what counterplans actually present a valid opportunity cost to the plan. And the way, and this I think was alluded to earlier, but the way that you determine whether or not a counterplan presents a valid opportunity cost is whether or not the counterplan is competitive. So we're going to introduce this notion of counterplan competition. Obviously, the existence of any net desirable policy is insufficient to negate an affirmative plan on its own. There needs to be some reason why it can't be combined, or it would be worse to combine it with a plan. Otherwise, you could envision unbeatable counterplans like the Feed the World counterplan or the Colonized Space counterplan, or any infinite number of potentially good ideas that have harms that outweigh the affirmatives on scope. And it would be impossible for the negative to defeat, or for the affirmative rather, to defeat all of those counterplans without having presented the absolute best idea ever from the 1AC, which obviously is ludicrous because the affirmative is constrained by the resolution. So we limit the notion of counterplans that actually present an opportunity cost to the AF, or reasons to negate the AF, to those that are competitive. And we call a counterplan competitive if its existence is sufficient to refute the desirability of the plan. In other words, a counterplan is competitive if it presents an opportunity cost to the plan. Now, there are two ways a counterplan can compete, and whether or not, and ways you can determine that a counterplan competes. The first way, and the most intuitive and most obvious form of competition, is mutual exclusivity. Just basically means the plan and the counterplan cannot coexist in the same world. The most logical, or the most obvious examples of these are the genre of counterplans that are like ban the plan, ban security cooperation, withdraw from NATO, and you have arguments why you can't couple security cooperation with NATO while the United States has simultaneously banned security cooperation with NATO. So these are the easiest kinds of counterplans to generate competition for. They are also usually the most limited because beyond ban the plan, there's not really clear examples of counterplans that are mutually exclusive of the plan. So the vast majority of counterplans that you'll see today compete via net benefit. The idea behind competition by net benefit is that the difference between the plan and the counterplan avoids some net benefit, some disadvantage, usually, that the passage of the plan would link to. Now, the question then becomes, how do you establish whether or not a counterplan has a net benefit? You do that through a permutation. You'll hear the phrase that a permutation is a test of competition, but that is literally true. When you're kicking out of a counterplan in the 1NR and you can see the permutation is just a test of competition, that is all a permutation is. It is basically some combination of the plan text and the counterplan text that is provided in the 2AC to see whether or not the counterplan presents an opportunity cost to the AF, to see whether or not the only way to avoid the net benefit is to not include the affirmative in the final passage of the policy. So if there is a world in which you can combine the plan and the counterplan, then it disproves the counterplan being an opportunity cost to the plan, right? If you can combine the plan and the Feed the World counterplan, then obviously the best policy option for the judge to endorse is the world in which both of those policies are passed. And so if the best policy option is a world that still includes the affirmative, then the affirmative is on net desirable and the counterplan does not present an opportunity cost to the AF. What about counterplans that are like plank 1, solve advantage 1, plank 2, solve advantage 2, plank 3, colonize space, plank 4, ban the plan? Why is that counterplan not competitive? It seems like the last plank of that counterplan presents mutual exclusivity with the plan. Yes.
Because with the permutation, you just have to permute all of the plan and you can permute parts.
Right.
Not all.
Yes, because to avoid this exact problem, the rule that we've established for permutations is that you can permute all of the plan and part of the counterplan. Otherwise, you can foresee counterplans like this, in which neg teams will just tack on planks like ban the plan or ban security cooperation to the end in order to make the counterplan artificially competitive, in order to present an artificial opportunity cost to the plan. And so we consider a legitimate permutation one that includes all of the plan and all or parts of the counterplan. And so this is actually an overall important distinction. So I'm going to write this down. The counterplan is competitive if and only if, one, there exists a net benefit that is predicated on the difference between the plan and the counterplan. Or it could be mutually exclusive, but for the purposes of this, we're just going to consider net benefits. And then second, put differently, no permutation can be crafted that includes all of the plan and part of the counterplan without linking to the net benefit. And so this is basically just a restatement of what we've indicated before, what counterplans actually present an opportunity cost to the AF. And this is going to be important later, so that we're all on the same page when we talk about counterplans that questionably present an opportunity cost to the AF. Counterplans that have internal net benefits that aren't reasons why the AF is bad, but are instead reasons why the counterplan is good. And so even though we have a consistent definition of what counterplans are competitive and what permutations can be crafted to test whether or not a counterplan is competitive, there are still gray areas in terms of, for instance, what is an acceptable difference between the plan and the counterplan? What is considered part of the counterplan versus all of the plan? And those are the questions that we're going to talk about a little bit later when we move on to philosophies of competition. Before we do that, however, does anyone have any questions based on what we've talked about so far? Perfect. I'm going to take a brief segue from this discussion of counterplan competition specifically to talk about a special case of a permutation, perm do the counterplan. Probably heard this phrase in debates before. Essentially, every legitimate permutation is some version of the plan and part of the counterplan, right? So perm do both is literally just putting together the text of the plan and the counterplan. Perm do the AF and the first two planks of the counterplan against that advantage counterplan that we were talking about before, etc. There are also perms that are debatably severance. So some part of the plan is omitted, and intrinsic. So something additional that is neither in the plan nor the counterplan is included in the permutation. Those are special cases, and those are arguments that you can make for why a permutation is illegitimate if it includes something other than all of the plan and part of the counterplan. But we'll go over those later. Right now, we're just considering standard permutations, like variations of permutation do both. Perm do the counterplan is a special case. Its text is just the counterplan, and the argument is that the reason why the permutation is legitimate is because the counterplan includes all the affirmative. It tests competition by testing whether or not the counterplan is a way the plan could be implemented. It's important to note that perm do the counterplan is a statement about what the plan could be instead of what the plan is or what the most efficacious version of the plan is. If the AF says perm do the counterplan against the court counterplan in the 2AC, that doesn't commit them to being the courts. They can also say perm do the counterplan against the con-con counterplan because a permutation is a test of competition. It is not a reclarification of what the AF is in the 2AC, which is a common mistake that you'll often see in these debates. The reason why perm do the counterplan is important is because it's debated out for process counterplans like the environmental impact statement counterplan or the commission's counterplan, which basically has the plan subjected to the review of a nonpartisan commission, which the negative will claim avoids the politics disadvantage, or the consult counterplan, which they'll be like, we should consult Japan first before doing the plan because it avoids potential backlash by Japanese policymakers. The point is that there's a series of these counterplans to which the plan is subject to a series of additional modifications or a distinct process for which there is a net benefit derived from. In other words, these are counterplans, and let me erase this. These are counterplans that subject the AF to a probability scheme. And so the distinction is that these types of counterplans reduce, but they still leave open the possibility of the affirmative being fiated in its original form, right? If you have the commission's counterplan, and the text of the commission's counterplan is the commission is vested with authority over NATO security cooperation, the commission recommends the plan, the president implements the commission's recommendations, the negative will have arguments about why that is competitive because the counterplan is not certain, it is not immediate, it leaves the final policy open to different versions because it's subject to modifications by the commission, but it still leaves open the possibility of fiating the plan, right? We call those counterplans those that are subject to a probability scheme. And those are the types of counterplans you should almost always go for perm to the counterplan or a competition argument against, because it is very difficult to derive deficits to those counterplans. Other than saying some version of immediacy key if you happen to have a time frame sensitive advantage, or certainty key or signaling key if you have a reason why the process of the counterplan is obscure or unexpected, it becomes very difficult for the affirmative to generate substantive offense against these types of counterplans because the negative is designed, these counterplans, to steal most, if not all, of the affirmative. And so you want to go for competition against these types of counterplans. And the distinction or argument that you'll oftentimes see AF teams draw out in these debates is normal means for DAs, but not for counterplan competition. That's oftentimes, hedging that you'll see in cross-ex in these debates. If the neg asks the agent of the plan when they see cross-ex, the AF might respond Congress, but they'll clarify that Congress, but that doesn't make the court counterplan or the executive counterplan competitive. Why is that? Why can the AF have one version of the plan that they utilize for DA links and topicality, we meet arguments and violations, and another version of the plan that is used for counterplan competition and whether or not a legitimate permutation can be crafted to demonstrate whether or not the counterplan presents an opportunity cost? The reason why is because there's a distinction between, or the affirmative wants to portray the distinction, and if you're in the negative, you obviously wants to say the opposite, that the affirmative should be held to everything that they've said in the round. But there's a distinction between mandates and effects of the plan. Mandates are things that the affirmative has very clearly committed to from the outset of the debate, either in the plan text or in the resolution or some committed cross-ex answer. NATO, the United States federal government, security cooperation, any counterplan that picks out of those functions or those words in the plan is obviously competitive. Effects are the likely outcome of the plan, which you can use to generate links to DAs, but not as a basis for counterplan competition since it is not something the AF has committed to. So for example, the agent of the plan is the example that we provided before. It's also the reason why you can't pick out advantages. So for example, a couple years back on the high school immigration topic, there was an AF that was read that was like, we should bring in more AI workers and raise the immigration caps because America currently has a shortage of high-skilled workers in the United States. That AF had an advantage about taking those workers from China and basically had a reverse brain drain argument about the United States winning the tech race by liberalizing its immigration, so more tech workers would come here instead of China. Now, barring the strategic implications of this, obviously this pick would not be super strategic in this round, but with a pick out of China, if the plan text just says raise immigration caps, be competitive. No, why not?
The scheme is just a way.
Right. The AF has said that the most likely effect of the plan would be taking workers from China, but the affirmative has not committed to that in the plan text. The affirmative has just said that we should raise immigration caps. And so if the negative were to tack on raise immigration caps, except workers from China, that's arguably Plan Plus, right? It's something that the affirmative has not committed to in the plan text. It's an additional restriction the negative has imposed. And so the affirmative can either say perm do both or perm do the counterplan, because a potential reading of the plan text that just raises immigration caps is raising immigration caps from all countries except for China. Negative has the effect, the negative's addition had the effect of clarifying what the plan did, but a legitimate reading of the plan would still be the counterplan in that world. And so this is why plan texts have become progressively vaguer over the years, right? You don't want to write a super specific plan text, because the more things the affirmative commits to from the outset of the debate, the more things they have now committed to for the purposes of counterplan competition. And so the less counterplans you can permute, and the more counterplans you actually need to generate a substantive deficit against. But you can utilize this type of argument to answer normative reasons why should means immediate and certain, for instance, which is when you see a counterplan like EIS, commissions, or consult, oftentimes the negative defends those counterplans by reading a long list of definitions in the block, right? They'll say resolved means certain, should means immediate, should mean certain, and they'll just like define all the words in the plan text and the resolution to explain why the affirmative requires immediacy and certainty. The problem is there's no intrinsic reason why the word should, for instance, means certain or immediate, right? If I say I should go to the store, that's not a guarantee that I will go to the store. It's in fact the opposite. It is a value statement that I should go to the store, but it leaves open the possibility that I do not go to the store. And so the definitions that you'll see of immediacy and certainty debates are oftentimes very, very bad and do not require a lot to defeat them, other than just reading a definition of your own that says the opposite. And evenly debated, a perm do the counterplan in the cases of counterplans that subject the aft to a probability scheme will almost always be adjudicated in favor of the affirmative, just because if there's definitions going both ways, and the only relevant question for perm do the counterplan is whether or not the counterplan is a permissible reading of the plan text, as long as you have some definition that says that the affirmative could be some example of the counterplan, then that's sufficient to meet your burden on perm do the counterplan, right? It is sufficient to disprove that the counterplan is competitive. And so generally, perm do the counterplan is extremely winnable for any counterplan that preserves the ability to fiat the plan. It is less winnable against counterplans like the recommend counterplan, or the version of the ICJ counterplan that just has the ICJ recommend the plan to the United States, but never fiats the United States actually take up the plan. But the strategic cost of those counterplans is that they are far more susceptible to solvency deficits as a result. Perm do the counterplan is typically an argument you go for when your only deficits are like signaling or delay or certainty type deficits. That's everything that I wanted to go over for the first part about opportunity cost and competition. Before I move on to the next part, does anyone have any questions based upon that? Perfect. I'm going to plug in my computer because it's about to die, and then we can move on to the next one. All right, let's see. Here's this. Philosophies of competition. And this becomes, now we're going to return to, these statements right here. No perm can be crafted that includes all of the plan and part of the counterplan without linking to the net benefits. The question is, how do you determine what is part of the counterplan or all of the counterplan? Similarly, how do you determine what is the difference between the plan and the counterplan, particularly for counterplans that do most, if not all of the plan? This is not as objective as it seems. So consider the Department of State counterplan that I think was released earlier at this camp. It's a very long counterplan text. I'm not going to write it all on the board. It basically goes some version of USFG should reform and resource the Department of State, expand and train the security assistance workforce, review and optimize planning and dispute resolution, and adapt best practices from the Department of Defense. What is part of that counterplan? Would it be reforming and resourcing the Department of State? That's the first part of the counterplan text, but the second part of the counterplan text modifies that by saying that we should only resource the Department of State by expanding and training the security assistance workforce. So would part of the counterplan just be resourcing the Department of State in the abstract? Or is that more than the counterplan alone because it provides resources to the DOS for more than just security assistance? Similarly, if you have the last part of the counterplan that says we should adapt best practices from the Department of Defense, if we remove the part of the counterplan text that was Department of Defense, and we just said we should adapt best practices from another agency, is that more or less than the counterplan? Because a function of the counterplan is just simply the Department of State looking at and adapting best practices from other agencies. If we look at a counterplan just in terms of attempting to divide it into discrete functions, particularly for super complex advantage counterplans or process counterplans that do a lot of things, it can get very arbitrary very quickly what part of the counterplan means in this context. What is a discrete function of the counterplan that we can include in a permutation such as this one? And so we've agreed that a counterplan is competitive if no legitimate permutation can be constructed that solves or avoids the net benefit while including all of the plan. The question then becomes, what constitutes a legitimate permutation? And there are really 3 schools of thoughts on this, but we're going to mostly focus on 2 today as to what constitutes, basically counterplan competition. We're going to start by talking about functional competition. Functionally competitive is the most intuitive, most common form of competition you'll see in these debates. It just means that the counterplan does something different than the plan, and there's a net benefit predicated on the act of doing something different. Essentially, every counterplan you can think of competes off some version of functional competition. So take the court counterplan from a couple of years ago on the criminal justice reform topic. The affirmative said the affirmative had to be Congress because of some word in the resolution that said the affirmative had to be Congress. The negative reads the counterplan that says the Supreme Court should do the plan instead, picks out of that word in the resolution, and then reads the politics DA that links to the permutation that includes Congress passing the plan. So that is an example of a functionally competitive counterplan. The negative does something different and has a net benefit, in this case, politics, that is predicated on a different agent doing the plan. Similar example can be seen last year with the business confidence DA and the advantage counterplan. The affirmative reads a water policy. The negative says that water reform in the United States is perceived as environmentally onerous by businesses, which crushes business confidence and hurts the economy. But we have this advantage counterplan that is perceived as business friendly and avoids that shock to the environmental, to the economy. And so that's another example of a functionally competitive counterplan, even if an advantage counterplan in the abstract is not functionally competitive because you can combine it with the plan. The reason why you can't combine it in the plan in that instance is because there's a DA to the permutation, the BizCon DA, to the act of including the plan in the final policy. So basically, everyone agrees at minimum counterplans need to be functionally competitive. I think that's pretty intuitive so far. What really gets interesting is when we start mixing in textual competition. Now, some people will say that for a counterplan to be textually competitive, all it needs to do is include different words in the plan text. Those people are incorrect. Different words is a necessary yet insufficient indicator of a counterplan that is textually competitive, because you can have any counterplan that is different than the plan, right? The relevant question for competition, and the reason why you can't have a competitive counterplan really, except ones that's mutually exclusive without a net benefit, the relevant question for competition is the net benefit. You can't have a competitive counterplan without one. In the same way that an advantage counterplan that does something totally different than the plan is not functionally competitive unless you have something like the BizCon DA that links to the permutation, a counterplan can't be textually competitive unless there's a net benefit staked on the textual difference between the plan and the counterplan. So let's take the example of, just really any process counterplan. Let's say the commission's counterplan that we were talking about before. It's like the commission should investigate and recommend the plan. The negative writes that counterplan text, and they copy and paste the plan text into the counterplan text. But instead of the word should in the plan text, they replace it with the word ought. Is this counterplan textually competitive? Why or why not? What do we think? We've just taken the counterplan text, or we've taken the plan text rather, and we've replaced the word should with ought. Yes.
Like the permutation could replace ought with should, and that would still be part of the counterplan.
Yes, exactly. Remember, we've established that a permutation, all it has to do to be legitimate is include part of the counterplan, right? If the counterplan is the United States federal government ought to, we can replace the word ought in the counterplan with should from the plan text. And it includes all of the plans of the original plan text, and then part of the counterplan, the entire counterplan text minus the word ought. And it demonstrates that in this instance, because there's not a should bad net benefit, the negative doesn't have a reason why saying the word should in the plan is necessary to avoid, or not saying the word should is necessary to avoid the net benefit. The perm that simply substitutes the word ought with should is sufficient to solve that net benefit, or at least disprove textual competition in that instance. As a side note, because, note that, this is getting kind of complicated in terms of texts and different parts of counterplans that we are permuting. It's important that when you're making permutations in the 2AC other than perm do both and perm do the counterplan, that there's some sort of explicit text in the 2AC as to what parts of the counterplan that you're permuting. So typically the way this is done is you take the plan text that you have to include in the permutation, and then you take the words of the counterplan text that you're permuting, and you put that together in the speech doc as like a full permutation text the judge and the other team can refer to later to determine what parts of the counterplan you're specifically permuting. And we'll look at some specific examples of permutations later, other than perm do both and perm do the counterplan, so you can see a little bit more concretely what the perm text looks like. But just remember when putting 2 ACs together and specifically going for some of these perms, it's very helpful and oftentimes necessary in a textual competition debate to include some sort of text in your 2AC documents. Returning to textual competition, however, the problem with this standard is that really the only example of a counterplan that is textually but not functionally competitive are word picks, which is why textual competition isn't a super useful standard on its own. The reason why is because in the case of a word pick, the net benefit to a word pick is literally predicated on taking that word out of the plan, right? You have a reason why, for example, water resources is a colonialist phrase, you replace it with, I don't know, like water management or something, and you have a counterplan that functionally accomplishes the exact same thing as the plan, but has a very minor net benefit predicated on omitting those words from the plan text. Other than that, any word that you pick out of in the plan text or omit for the purposes of competition in your counterplan typically will have some impact on the function of the counterplan as well, right? Like if you pick out of NATO and go for the OSCE counterplan, or you pick out of security cooperation, you go for a different type of cooperation instead. Likely the removal or the omission of those words from the plan text will have some impact on functional implementation of the counterplan. And so it's easy for the affirmative to go for deficits against, not easy, but it's generally easier for the affirmative to generate deficits against those types of counterplans. But for a textually competitive counterplan, like a word pick, there's no functional difference. The only difference is in the text between the plan and the counterplan. So that might beg the question, like, why do we keep textual competition around at all as a standard? Well, remember when we were talking about before how difficult it was to break down the Department of State counterplan into discrete functions, right? Like there was unclear what part of that counterplan actually meant. The advantage of textual competition is that it's objective. You know exactly the difference between the plan and the counterplan based upon the words that are removed or included in the permutation text. And so textual competition, proponents of textual competition will say that we should determine counterplans and we should determine whether or not a counterplan is competitive and presents an opportunity cost to the AF based upon what the counterplan and the plan say. Proponents of functional competition will say that we should determine whether or not a counterplan presents an opportunity cost based upon what the plan and the counterplan do. If you're in the negative, you should say that winning any of these types of competition, like if you win the counterplan is textually competitive, it proves that there's a point of difference between the plan and the counterplan, and that proves the counterplan is competitive. Similarly, if you win that the counterplan is functionally competitive, then that should be sufficient for you to win if the counterplan is competitive on its own. If you're the affirmative in these debates, you want to set a higher bar for counterplans, right? You want to exclude more counterplans. You want to make it harder for the negative to generate a counterplan that competes with the AF. And so you want to say that counterplans need to be both functionally and textually competitive. We're going to talk about that a little bit more in section 3, but for now, keep in mind that the negatives argument is that counterplan, well, the negatives argument is really only going to be that counterplans need to only be functionally competitive because of the issue that we talked about before with textual competition. The affirmative's argument is going to be that counterplans need to be both functionally and textually competitive. The final type of argument that I want to touch on briefly is positional competition. This is not super common term in debates anymore, although you will still sometimes see it tossed around. This became popularized due to an article that I believe was written in 2013 by Brett Bricker, who's a debate coach at the University of Kansas. You can Google it, read it online if you want. But the idea is that the affirmative has taken a position in a debate. And that position is what makes the counterplan competitive. It's not quite functional competition. It's not quite textual competition. It's the cumulative sum of statements the affirmative has made in the debate, constituting a position for what the plan text actually does. So for instance, if the affirmative says the actor of the plan is the Supreme Court in cross-sex, or at some point in the debate, it means that the Congress counterplan competes. The obvious problem with this model of competition is, what does it mean for the affirmative to take a position on something? Mostly everyone, even for functional competition, agrees that if the affirmative clearly commits in cross-sex to the actor of the plan being the Supreme Court, then yes, that should probably make an agent counterplan compete. But what about, highlighted lines of the 1AC solvency advocates, highlighted lines of random 1AC impact cards, parts of the solvency card that weren't even included in the 1AC cutting of the article? The problem is that the affirmative, what constitutes an affirmative position for the purposes of debate, can often be too broad, too fast. And the negative obviously wants to characterize that position that the affirmative has taken as broadly as possible, so they can make as many counterplans as possible compete. And so the affirmative argument against this positional competition argument is just, there's no bright line for what the affirmative has or has not committed to. If the affirmative hasn't made the explicit choice to defend something in the debate through the reading of the plan text being the most objective standard for what the plan actually does, then they shouldn't be bound to it for the purposes of counterplan competition, because it creates a moral hazard for the negative to find, more and more, arcane things in the 1AC to pick out of. So positional competition you will often see thrown around, particularly in negative competition blocks. But it's not, evenly debated. It's probably not a winning standard for the negative on its own. That's everything that I wanted to talk about in terms of the differences between functional, textual, and positional competition. Before we move on to the last part, does anyone have any questions? Wonderful. All right. Let's talk about intrinsicness and permutations. So remember what we were talking about before is like the affirmative in these debates wants to present the argument that counterplans need to be both functionally and textually competitive. It wants to say that a counterplan that is not both functionally and textually competitive does not satisfy these criteria. There's not a clear net benefit that is based upon the difference between the plan and the counterplan if, for instance, the whole counterplan text is just included, or the whole plan text rather, is just copied and pasted and included into the counterplan text. And so the question then becomes, how do you test whether or not a counterplan is both functionally and textually competitive? One way you can do that is an intrinsic permutation. Intrinsicness in this instance, and we touched on this briefly earlier, but it just means something that is neither in the plan nor the counterplan. And so if counterplans need to be both functionally and textually competitive, which is the threshold the 2AC should always set, then a permutation that is functionally legitimate but textually intrinsic, or functionally intrinsic but textually legitimate, should be sufficient to disprove one axis of competition. I'm going to go through both of those again slower. First, functionally non-intrinsic but textually intrinsic. So functionally non-intrinsic, textually intrinsic. What does this mean? Actually, taking a step back for a second, the reason why we have this idea of intrinsicness is because if we have a functionally non-intrinsic, textually intrinsic permutation, and a permutation is just a test of competition, even though this permutation is textually intrinsic, because it is functionally non-intrinsic, because it is functionally legitimate, it still tests whether or not the counterplan is functionally competitive. And remember, the affirmative needs to only disprove one of the types of competition. Either the counterplan is not functionally competitive or not textually competitive. So if the affirmative can win this permutation, they've established that the counterplan is not competitive and does not present a valid opportunity cost to the plan. Now, why do we make now, why can't we just say, well, if intrinsic permutation still tests whether or not the affirmative or the counterplan presents an opportunity cost to the plan, why don't we let the affirmative just make any permutation intrinsic? Well, you can imagine that if the affirmative was allowed to make any intrinsic permutation in existence, that would run into the same problem as we were talking about before with unpermutable negative counterplans. The affirmative can permute to counterplan in any source of offense, essentially, that was neither in the plan nor the counterplan in the 1AC or the 1NC. And so there needs to be some backstop or some check on the level of intrinsicness the AF is allowed to make. And so here, you are constrained by the functional range of the plan and the counterplan. There's not a ton of things you could tack on, even if you can add infinite words that are not in the plan or the counterplan text, because you're still confined by the function of what the mandate of what the plan includes and the mandate of what the counterplan includes. And so this is a fairly easy permutation to justify because it tests functional competition. We generally all agree that functional competition is good. And there's not a ton of permutations that you can craft with these parameters because you're still confined to the functions of the plan and the counterplan. What is an example of a counterplan that would be useful to go for this type of permutation against? Well, let's take a look at an example. The USFG should first strike Russia if and only if plan. Pretty apparent artificial opportunity cost, right? The USFG should first strike Russia if and only if the plan happens. The trick of this is that if the negative is going to claim that the affirmative tries to make a permutation, any permutation that includes the plan is going to trigger the first strike of Russia because the counterplan text says we will only first strike Russia if the plan were to happen. So the introduction of the opportunity cost here is artificial. There's no reason why the plan would intrinsically cause us to first strike Russia. It's only because of the counterplan that's being introduced that presents that opportunity cost. So can anyone think of a functionally non-intrinsic, textually intrinsic permutation that might solve the net benefit to this counterplan? The net benefit being first striking Russia is bad. Remember, you can add words, but you have to maintain the same function of the counterplan or part of the function of the counterplan. Might help to take a step back and think of what the counterplan is doing here. Is the counterplan first striking Russia? What's the counterplan doing? Yes. Perfect. Yes. Let's just add the word not. The USFG plan and the USFG should not first strike Russia. Why can you do that? Well, the action of the counterplan is literally banning the first strike of Russia or first striking Russia. It's hidden with the way that the counterplan text is written. But if you were to just consider the counterplan in a vacuum without the plan happening, without the permutation, the only action that the counterplan does is forbid the United States from first striking Russia because in the status quo, the plan has not happened. And so the United States can't first strike Russia. And so you can permute part of the counterplan, the part of the counterplan that says we should not first strike Russia, without the part of the counterplan that introduces this artificial decision calculus to condition it on whether or not the plan happens. And the fact that it is so simple to create a permutation like this against a counterplan like this demonstrates why it is an artificial opportunity cost or an artificial trade-off the negative is trying to establish. The forced trade-off could be literally anything in this instance. It could be first strike Russia, it could be first strike China, it could be collapse the economy. It's unfair to make the affirmative debate any DA, the neg could just counterplan in like this, which is demonstrative that the affirmative needs some form of limited intrinsicness in order to check back against counterplans like this one. So does everyone see the power of, limited intrinsic permutations against counterplans like these that present some sort of artificial opportunity cost to the AF? Okay, let's look at the second category of permutations. And, just like we have functionally non-intrinsic, textually intrinsic permutations, we also have functionally intrinsic, textually non-intrinsic permutations. Right? Same concept, same theoretical backing as before. You start by, you take a permutation, just like this type of permutation tests functional competition. Here you have this type of permutation that is textually legitimate that tests textual competition. And so remember when I said before that affirmatives need to establish that you need to win both functional and textual competition. This is why it's important, because in order to win this type of permutation, you also need to win the arguments that textual competition is good. And so to write a permutation like this, actually, let's just take a look at an example. Write this US of G should increase cooperation with the OSCE over AI norms. Right? There are obviously other net benefits you can read with this counterplan, but let's just take the example of the net benefit that is just the internal net benefit, OSCE good. I don't remember exactly why the OSCE good. OSCE leadership solves extinction for some reason. What is an example of a functionally intrinsic, textually non-intrinsic permutation you can make with this counterplan text that solves the net benefit of OSCE leadership, assuming that you're reading the AI norms, AI interoperability F. Oh, lots. Yes.
Just simply the USFG should increase cooperation with the OSCE.
Perfect. Get rid of this. The net benefit's not staked on AI norms, right? The net benefit is just OSCE good. It's not even the plan is bad. It's an internal net benefit as to why OSCE leadership is good. There's no reason that the OSCE asserting leadership needs to be over the mandate to the plan. It could be over literally any other issue. And so the way that you want to strategically write functionally intrinsic, textually non-intrinsic permutations is you typically want to start by taking the counterplan text and just deleting words. So here we deleted the part of the counterplan text that mandated that cooperation be over AI norms. And the reason why this works is because any more generic example of the process is sufficient to solve the net benefit. It doesn't need to be over the AF because the net benefit is not a reason why the AF is bad. The net benefit is a reason why the counterplan is good. And so just like this counterplan presented an artificial opportunity cost, you can use permutations like this to establish why the OSCE counterplan doesn't also presents an artificial opportunity cost. Because the only reason why, because it doesn't have an actual reason why the inclusion of the plan is bad. The only reason that it has for why the counterplan is net beneficial is because the counterplan's process is good. You can also make the argument that this is not a functionally intrinsic permutation, right? It increases cooperation with the OSCE. Cooperation with the OSCE is a mandate of the counterplan text, the original counterplan text that included over AI norms. You can make the argument that this permutation would increase cooperation with the OSCE, but leave the target of that cooperation unspecified, which allows you to essentially, you can also make the argument that it's not functionally intrinsic because the target of that cooperation is unspecified. And so means it's not functionally intrinsic. Last thing I want to say is that functional textual competition will often get debated out a lot in these debates because in order to justify this permutation, you need to justify, some model of intrinsicness that would prevent the affirmative from getting access to infinite intrinsicness like we were talking about before. And so one of the negative arguments against textual competition in this context, well, there will actually be two of them. The two neg arguments that you'll likely see deployed against textual competition in this context are one, that textual competition is overly semantic, that nobody cares about the exact words of the plan or the counterplan. Plan text change each tournament, and just because you can retain all of the words in the counterplan and play word games to solve the net benefit doesn't mean the counterplan is competitive. And the second argument you'll see is that because this style of permutation, all it relies upon is retaining all or part of the words in the counterplan text. You'll often see the negative make the argument that it becomes too easy for the negative or the affirmative to craft permutations to solve net benefits in this instance. It becomes too easy to craft a perm with some combo of the words in the plan and the counterplan text in order to solve the net benefit. And I'll leave you with an example from the DOS counterplan that we were talking about before, which is like the United States federal government should reform and resource the Department of State, increase security assistance and training, and adapt best practices in the Department of Defense. But note that that counterplan text includes the words the United States federal government, resource, and Department of Defense. And so a textually legitimate, although functionally intrinsic permutation you can make against that counterplan is the United States federal government should reform and resource the Department of Defense to solve the DoD trade-off net benefit. Now, is that a legitimate permutation? Under this model of functional and textual competition, arguably yes, because it uses all the words in the plan, part of the counterplan, and it has and you have a reason why resourcing the Department of Defense would solve the DoD trade-off net benefits. The negative argument is that the fact that these permutations are possible with this type of competition model demonstrates that it's too easy for the affirmative to exclude too many types of counterplans. So that's the debate you ultimately end up having. But the idea is that with a lot of these counterplans that either present artificial opportunity costs to the AF or are designed to steal most, if not all, of the affirmative's offense, you need some sort of way to go for a competition type strategy against those counterplans. And the way that you often exploit that is by going for permutations that reveal why the net benefit to the counterplan is artificial or internal. It's not a D8 to the affirmative. There's a reason why the counterplan is good. And so a more generic example of the counterplan's process is usually sufficient to solve those counterplans. That's everything that I wanted to talk about. I know you have lab in a couple minutes, but does anyone have any questions about anything that I talked about or just, counterplans or debate generally in the last 2 minutes that we have? Yes.
Like writing a YC plan text, is there anything you keep in mind or you should do to ensure that you can generate intrinsic terms?
That's a good question. So I think generally when writing YC text or plan text, the most important thing is you just have a defense of all of the words that you're including in the plan text. So especially you shouldn't have random verbs or random words in the plan text that you don't have definitions of, or you aren't prepared for the negative to pick out of. I imagine it's not a huge deal on this topic because it seems like most plan texts are just increased security cooperation of NATO, and then it says the word AI at the end. But that's something that I would keep in mind. I don't think there's really a way you can write a plan text to exclude there's not really a way you can write a plan text to make writing intrinsic permutations any easier. You can play some tricks. You could add extra words into the plan text, and then you can make the argument that you can duplicate those words in any permutation text and in a way that could potentially solve the net benefit to some counterplans. But I think evenly debated out, that's probably not a great argument for the AF. So I would just, focus on making your plan text solid enough to defend mostly from picks and not for the purposes of intrinsic perms. Any other questions? Great. That's all I had. Feel free to reach out if any other questions come up, but if not, thank you all for coming.